we go. Hey guys, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Again, this is our first show in a 3-part series called A Lot on the Mind. And the goal of this series is to take the most misunderstood neurological disorders and demystify them. So talk about what they are, how people get diagnosed, the science behind them, but also to highlight the patient experience as well. So talk about stigmas and highlight patient talents. And so tonight we're going to talk about epilepsy. On January 9th, we have a show on autism. And on February 11th, we have a show on Huntington's disease. And so tonight's show is brought to you by Brainy, but also the Epilepsy Foundation. And we have 3 presenters. So I'm Stephanie Rogers. I'll be giving the first portion. I am a PhD candidate at NYU and an adjunct instructor at Fordham. And my goal is really to make science accessible. We have our second portion being delivered by Dr. Simon Chamberlain. He is a postdoctoral fellow in Dr. Richard Chen's lab, and he's interested in how brain cells communicate with one another and how CBD can alter that. And then we'll have a brief intermission, about 7 minutes, and then we will have the very talented Alyssa D'Amico. So she is an epilepsy patient, but more importantly, she's a poet. This is her work here, published. We will have copies available for you to purchase for $10 at intermission, and it's absolutely phenomenal. And so she'll be giving us a reading from some of her works there. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. So you all are here because you're at least interested in learning a little more about epilepsy. And we're going to talk about what it is, how to get diagnosed with it, and then we're going to talk about what a seizure is. So to be diagnosed with epilepsy, you just need to have a predisposition to have epileptic seizures. Now what a seizure is, there's 2 components. The first component is that there's some kind of sensory disturbance. So the way you perceive your world is somehow altered. And this has to be accompanied by abnormal electrical activity in the brain. It's extremely common, so 1 in 26 Americans will develop epilepsy at some point. 1 in 10 will have a seizure during his or her lifetime. It has a myriad of causes, so brain infection, head trauma, brain tumor and stroke, any kind of trauma to the brain. We also have genetic forms, and we also have many patients who don't have any known cause. So there's no genetic marker, and there's no history of trauma. Okay, so I mentioned this sensory disturbance to you, and this is one component of a seizure. And so I'm sure most of you have at least seen a seizure in popular media. It's usually depicted as a convulsion, so a person will get very stiff, they may fall, their limbs may jerk, but this is by no means the only type of seizure. So I'm going to show you a couple video clips of my sister. Her name is Carissa, and she has untreatable epilepsy. And I'm going to show you some of these clips, and I'm going to ask you if you think she's having a seizure, or if you think this is just we captured some normal behavior on video.
Carissa. 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 Are you worked up about anything? Chris, try to come out of it.
All right.
Okay. How do you feel? Can you answer me? Can you answer Mom?
I don't know.
Okay.
All right. Show of hands, how many of you think or would have thought she was just spacing out? Maybe daydreaming a little bit? Yeah, most people do. So this is referred to as an absence seizure. And the phenotype, or what the behavior is here, is just this sort of blank staring, this inability to communicate or to process information. This is particularly troublesome in that it's one of the most difficult types of epilepsy to detect, particularly in children. So a child who kind of has these spacing out episodes is often labeled as maybe unruly or just can't concentrate. Many people don't realize that these are actually a type of seizure. Okay, how about this one?
Hey.
What do you think? Would you guys realize that was a seizure? No? Most people wouldn't. So this is what we refer to as a complex partial. So what this means is just only a few regions of the brain have been recruited or are participating in the abnormal electrical activity. And so here, in this case, it's a repetitive motion. So she turns to the right and plays with her clothes. You'll notice that both of these seizures only last about 30 seconds or so. And this is stereotypical for her type of epilepsy. Okay? So the next question is, how can this happen? And so to understand what happens in an epileptic brain, we have to understand some basic concepts about how the brain works in general. And so there are over 100 billion cells in your brain. And these cells all talk to one another. And they all talk to one another in very, very complex ways that we like to call little networks. Okay? And so I want you to think about this in that, imagine you're at a football game. And you're in a conversation with your friends about the latest dress you bought Black Friday shopping. The people behind you are talking about last week's football game. The guy to your right is on the phone, and the people to your left are talking about the new cell phone they just bought. And so you're all engaged in your own conversations. But let's say you overhear that conversation about the cell phone, and it reminds you that you need a new charger for your cell phone. And so even though you're not directly participating in that conversation, you are influenced by it. And that's how our brain processes a lot of information. And so what happens in an epileptic brain? And so what happens here is, again, imagine you're at that football or let's say hockey game, and you're all engaged in your own conversations, but now there's a rowdy kid in the back who starts a chant. So I'm from Pittsburgh, and my team is the Penguins, so I'm, of course, going to use the Penguins as my example. But let's say you're watching, and all of a sudden someone goes, "Let's go Pens. Let's go Pens." Yeah? Let's go Pens. Let's go Pens. Good. You guys just participated in a seizure. So what happens is that regardless of the conversation you had beforehand, you are now participating in the exact same words at the exact same time. And that's exactly what happens during a seizure, is that all the cells start firing or communicating at the exact same time with the exact same rhythm. So this is a seizure in your brain. And what does this chant actually look like? So I mentioned that our brain uses electrical activity. And so we can measure the electrical activity, or this output, as voltage from an EEG. So you just put little electrodes on the scalp, and they can actually measure what the cells are doing. And so what this chant looks like is right here, you see that all these channels represent different regions of the brain. And you see at this point, many regions start firing at the same time, with the same rhythm. And that is what we call a seizure. This is very stereotypical seizure activity. And so you will see this in a region of the brain accompanied with that behavioral change. And so we talked about the different types of seizures a little bit. I showed you 2 different types that my sister has, so the absence and the complex partial. We all know that there are convulsions because I'm sure you've seen it in TV shows. And so why do you think this is? How can seizures look so different if what I just told you is that all a seizure is just a bunch of cells firing at the same time with the same rhythm? You get different seizures because you have different parts of your brain. And each part of your brain is responsible for one or many unique aspects of your function and your personality. So we have these 4 major lobes plus the cerebellum. We have the frontal lobe here that is involved in motor control and concentration. We have the parietal lobe, which is touch and sensation and taste. We have the occipital lobe, which is vision, and we have the temporal lobe, which is hearing, facial recognition, and also learning and memory. And so what can happen is that this abnormal electrical activity will be, in this case, restricted to one region of the brain. And depending on which region of the brain it's restricted to will affect what the seizure looks like. So if someone has a seizure that's restricted to the occipital lobe, they may have a seizure where they get flashing lights across their vision. If you have a convulsion, what that means is that the seizure is generalized. It is now involving many different regions of the brain. And so I think you can see how this can end up creating many different types of seizures, because depending on how many areas they recruit is going to dictate what the seizure looks like. Okay? So now we're going to get a little interactive, and I'm going to come down off the stage, and I'm going to ask you guys to show me what you would do if someone had a seizure. Okay? Don't be afraid, don't be scared, no one's judging you here, but I want everyone to get up for a second. Come on, I'm serious, we're doing this. All right, so I want one person is going to be the person having a seizure. And I want you to sort of move around. So you can do like a turning around motion, you can walk if you want. And I want the other person in the group to show me what they would do. How would you help this person? Okay? Let's go. Who wants to help me? You want to help me? All right, let's do this. No pressure.
Worst stage fright in the whole place.
Oh.
Let's go.
All right, let's do this. This is your shot. Okay.
Fame.
All right. Yeah, let's do it. All right.
Probably sit.
Okay. Okay. Very good. You did a great job. See, you're ready for fame.
Thanks. I also have seizures.
Oh, perfect. All right, let's see. Okay, great. I'm seeing a lot of the right thing, which is fantastic. So what you want to do is you always want to be careful, okay? So you never want to restrain the person. Remember that during a seizure, the person is not fully aware all the time. And so if they're moving their arm, or if they're walking in a circle, or if they're walking somewhere, they're not fully aware, and they can't voluntarily change their activity. And even in the types of seizures where they are aware, they may not be able, and they are not able to control the movements, okay? So most of you got this right. The best thing is to just gently guide. You want to come up?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, come on up. What's your name?
Megan.
All right, we have Megan here.
Hey, everybody.
All right, so she did exactly the right thing. Okay, would you like to show?
Oh.
Sure.
What I did?
Yeah.
Sure. I grabbed a chair and kind of pulled it out and just gently guided her into it. Which I don't have a chair right now, but. You get the
Perfect.
idea.
We're actors now. We got this. Good job. Thank you, Megan. That's perfect. If the person is able to be led and you can kind of get them into a chair, that's great. If they are resisting, don't try and force them into anything, okay? So if they're really rigid and they don't want to sit, don't make them sit. What you want to do is then you would just clear any hazards or any objects that they could trip over or that they could bump into. If they're by a corner or something sharp, you can kind of try and put your body in front of the sharp object and lead them in the opposite direction. And so the biggest thing here is to basically do the least amount of harm. Seizures usually only last about 30 seconds. If they last longer than 2 minutes, you should always call 911. But they're usually over in 30 seconds. And the person will sometimes be confused when they come back to awareness. But for the most part, life will just go right back to normal once they're out of the seizure. There's no need to call the ambulance if they didn't seriously injure themselves. There's no reason to basically get very upset. It's something that usually happens a lot for these patients. And as long as they're not hurt, and as long as the seizure was less than 2 minutes, they're fine. Some patients can be very confused when coming out of a seizure. In this case, you'll just want to explain to them, hey, listen, you just had a seizure. Are you okay? Is there anything I can do for you? You can talk to them and see when they come back to awareness. So you'll be able to tell. You can ask them questions like, oh, when's your birthday? Or, oh, what were you doing just now? To make sure they're fully aware. Because one thing Carissa does, my sister, is that she can answer yes or no questions. So she loves classical music. She loves Beethoven. And so my go-to question to make sure she's fully out of her seizure is, name your favorite Beethoven song. If she can't name it, I know she's still a little confused, and I know that she's not fully back to awareness yet. And so in that case, again, you're just minimizing the potential harm, so make sure they don't do anything that could potentially harm them. Here's a question for you. Should you put something in that person's mouth? No, very good. So a very common myth with epilepsy is that you can swallow your tongue. You will not swallow your tongue if you try and put something into the mouth of a person who is having a seizure. You run the risk of them choking on it. So just steer clear of the mouth at all costs. All right, so what about the convulsion? So we talked about these more what we call complex partials, but what about when the person actually falls to the ground and their limbs are jerking? What do you think you should do then? Perfect. Great answer, Kiara. So you'll roll them onto the side. You'll put something soft under their head. So bunched up shirt, or you probably won't have access to a pillow, but a pillow's the best. And you just make sure that they can't hit their head off the ground. Another thing is that if they're wearing a choker necklace or a tie or something like that, then you'll want to remove that, because when they are moving, that can actually be very restrictive against their airways. And again, you'll time the seizure, so if it's longer than 2 minutes, you'll need to call 911. And then usually after the generalized seizures, the patients usually are confused. And so in that case, you really want to make sure you sit with them and make sure they're okay. So make sure that if they need anything, if they were in the middle of doing something, to ask them if they need help to finish what they were doing, and let them tell you what they need. Because nobody knows what they need better than the patients. Okay? Great. Good job, guys. You're all epilepsy first aid heroes now. Okay, so this is just a pictogram, again, showing the different types. So again, you can have these different complex partial seizures involving that blank staring, chewing, fumbling, wandering, shaking, confused speech. Again, time the seizure always, speak calmly, don't ever restrain a person, and you're going to block hazards. The most important thing, too, is to always be understanding. So these patients live with this every day, and they live with stigma. And you'll hear about the stigma with Alyssa's work as well. And so you don't want to make them feel uncomfortable or make them feel embarrassed or anything. Just say, hey, it's all right. You know, I got this. You're fine. Be supportive for them. Okay? And again, we went through this, but with generalized seizures, the tonic-clonic, you will cushion the head. You can remove eyeglasses or anything around the face that looks like it could potentially cause damage. You'll turn on the side and you'll loosen any tight clothing. Again, you never hold the people down because they're not in full control of their movements. So if you restrict them or restrain them, you can actually cause the dislocation of joints and cause more damage than if you had just let it go. And as the seizure ends, offer help. Okay, so you guys all know, and you guys can all provide proper first aid now, but I want to talk about 30% of patients right now. 30% of patients don't get any relief from currently available drugs. And so that means 30% of patients with epilepsy are likely to have seizures in the presence of others. So this is why that first aid is so important. And so for these patients, there's really limited options. So you have these kind of invasive options. So deep brain stimulation has been on the rise. This is a neurosurgery, so you are implanting an electrode into the brain. You have the removal of the epileptic focus. This is still very common. They actually take a chunk of brain out. That was the epileptic part of the brain. And then the vagus nerve stimulator. This is less invasive, but it still does involve like a microsurgery to put in a cord that wraps around the vagus nerve. And so I'm sure you guys have heard of it because it is being labeled as this miracle drug. But there's a brand new option now for these 30%, and that's CBD. And so Simon is going to come up, and he's going to actually tell us what is going on with this miracle drug, and is it really the miracle drug?